He became, I think, literally the personification of certainly American International Pictures 1950s science fiction. And later on, the personification of kind of indie genre filmmaking through the 60s and the 70s. And he continued directing right up until the very end of his life. And he was in his 90s. He was almost 100 years old when he directed his last film. And very few filmmakers have a career of that kind of longevity, or frankly, that kind of devotion to genre. Bert Gordon always was his own money. He was his own production company. Bert Gordon started with family money that the Gordons had for developing a part that was exclusive to Studebaker. And he made a film called Serpent Island. And this movie was done with his partner at the time, Tom Grise, who later on directed the pilot to the Rat Patrol, did a couple of really wonderful movies such as Will Penny and Breakheart Pass with Charles Bronson. And Grise became a real force in television. But here he was working with Bert I. Gordon. This was at the very start of everything. And they were able to get their little movie out. It was done very, very cheaply. But Bert had decided right from the get-go. He loved working with, I guess, the lizards and making them, he and his wife, Flora, then girlfriend, doing experimental work with split-screen photography and matte photography. And the result was King Dinosaur, which was about a rocket that lands on basically a prehistoric planet that is inhabited by giant lizards and giant insects and giant you name it. And those effects were, kind of Bert Gordon and Flora Gordon's specialty, and they were done with rear projection and microphotography, etc.
What a desolate, forsaken place. Get that rumbling. Almost an animal roar.
Still sounds like thunder to me. Do you want to go on or turn back?
Let's go on.
The film was not the greatest movie in the world, but Bert I. Gordon was able to sell it. And he was able to raise more money for his next movie, for a film that became a bit of a template for a number of the movies that he made at American International, for which he became very famous. But this first film was The Cyclops, starring Gloria Talbot and Tom Drake and Lon Chaney. And the plot is almost identical to Bert's own later War of the Colossal Beast, where you have a man who's been disfigured and grown to gigantic proportions. He only has one eye because his face has been torn up, and he is living in the mountains, and an expedition goes. In this case, they're looking for basically radium, and they discover this horrible, disfigured giant.
Crashing into this world of horror, a beautiful woman and 3 adventurers dare to challenge the unknown in a land where life and love is ruled by the Lord of Nightmares, the Cyclops.
Gloria Talbot always had wonderful memories of making this movie, only because Tom Drake used to like to have a drink or two, and of course so did Lon Chaney. Gloria Talbot always loved to remember that while they were filming, that Chaney's mom showed up with an air mattress and blew it up so he could take a nap in between shots. And she said, "I thought that was dear." And what's interesting is that here was Lon swinging his career back and forth, because it high noon, and then there he is in the Cyclops. The film did very well for Bert I. Gordon. It was released by Allied Artists on a double feature with Daughter of Dr. Jekyll, which was directed by Edgar G. Homer, but it did well. And Bert Gordon was able to, again, raise money, turn around, make a film, and sell it for more money than he had made the movie for. So once again, he was in profit, and he decided on his very first giant insect movie. And giant insects had started to become a movie staple ever since Them. And interestingly, Bert Gordon would work with the writer of Them, George Worthing Yates, on a number of movies. resulting movie was Peter Graves and Peggy Castle and Morris Ankrum starring in Beginning of the End about radioactive giant grasshoppers that invade Chicago. Bert Gordon and his wife Flora achieved the effects of the giant grasshoppers by using real grasshoppers, apparently imported, I believe, from Africa, that had a problem with they would die under the lights that they were using to film them, and they would have them crawling across miniature sets, or in some cases, crawling across photographs of skyscrapers, which looked actually pretty good, except there is one shot where a grasshopper actually walks onto the sky. But that's a very brief moment and has a lot of charm to it. I remember Peter Graves, I asked him about the movie, and he said, well, he got annoyed with Bert I. Gordon because Bert I. Gordon wanted him to dye his hair brown so he'd look more like Ronald Reagan. And he was still rankled about that. That was pretty funny.
The Air Force is standing by with an atom bomb. You can't drop an atom bomb on Chicago.
Beginning of the End, I think was really, you could say it was the beginning of the beginning. The Cyclops was one movie, but this movie really was, not only was giant insects, but Bert Gordon's technical capabilities had improved, and they're improving with every movie. You have to admire Bert Gordon because he wanted to do these kinds of special effects without a great deal of money. And the only way to do the effects was actually to do them. So each film, if you will, is kind of the Bert I. Gordon learning curve. And every time he got a little bit better and a little bit better and a little bit better. And he sold Beginning of the End to Republic Pictures, and he was starting to get some attention as somebody who could deliver this kind of movie for a price. Forrest J. Ackerman, the great editor of Famous Monsters of Filmland magazine, was also an agent. And he discussed with Bert a story called The Nth Man. Universal had had just wonderful success with Jack Arnold's great classic, The Incredible Shrinking Man. Bert Gordon decided, let's do the exact reverse, The Amazing Colossal Man. And The Nth Man was a wonderful place, jumping off place to start. And he went to American International, and that started his relationship there with Jim Nicholson and Samuel Z. Arkoff.
What happened? What made him grow?
Glenn Manning is growing from 8 to 10 feet a day. At the moment, he's 18 feet tall. Tomorrow, he'll be 26 feet. The next day, 35, maybe 40, and the next day...
But you've got to stop it.
The story of The Amazing Colossal Man, for which we all know and love, is about an Army officer who gets caught in a plutonium bomb explosion, and this affects his cellular growth, and he just keeps growing and growing and growing and growing. What Bert I. Gordon did, which was so just amazingly astute, and he showed that he was very smart about this. First, he hired the great Joe Byrock to shoot it. And Byrock was Sam Fuller's, one of his primary cameramen. He had worked with Fritz Lang. He would later shoot some John Wayne movies. He added, I think, a sense of visual style to the movie, particularly to the sequence where the Army officer, Colonel Glenn Manning, is caught in the plutonium explosion. And it's a wonderful sequence. The other thing that Bert Gordon did, which was also very smart, they started looking for the appropriate actor. Now, Universal had found a wonderful actor in Grant Williams to be the Shrinking Man. But what about the reverse? Grant Williams kind of, has a bit of a retiring personality, and he has to find his forcefulness as he gets smaller and smaller. Here, you wanted to have just someone whose own frustrations and personality would just explode because he was getting larger and larger and larger. And they found it in the 20th Century Fox leading man, Glenn Langan. Langan is tremendously good. He's amazing, colossally good. As this afflicted, poor soul who just you feel so sorry for, which is what makes the movie really unusual, and also partly in relationship to Incredible Shrinking Man, is there's an emotional context, an emotional connection to the central character. And he starts to lose his grip on reality, and there's a wonderful moment where he's there going, I'm not getting bigger, you're shrinking. Now, of course, now the movie is very often remembered for the moment where The Colossal Man takes a gigantic hypodermic needle, which is used to inject a drug into his ankle that supposedly will stop his growth. He pulls the needle out of his ankle, holds it up, and then throws it down, impaling the doctor who's trying to help him. And that hypo was built by AIP special effects master Paul Blaisdell.
The immeasurable power of this ever-growing mammoth portends a fate that terrifies the universe.
Drive it in hard. We have to penetrate the bone in the first ejection. Ready?
Look out, he's reaching down!
We want to help you to get well.
One of the also unsung contributors to The Amazing Colossal Man who worked very closely with Bert Gordon was screenwriter Mark Hanna. Hanna had done some very good work for Roger Corman. He scripted The Undead, also working in collaboration with Charles Griffith, scripted Not of This Earth. And Hanna's career would go beyond B-movies, as many of these guys did who were writing these genre films. They were also working on television at the same time. So Mark Hanna was a really talented guy, and he wrote a very, very good script for Amazing Colossal Man. And Bert rose to it, not only because he was working with Joe Byrock as his director of photography, but then he and Flora created some wonderful miniatures, including miniatures of Las Vegas. And of course, the ending of the movie is this poor man who was only trying to save someone else's life is shot and plunges off of Hoover Dam in that great pose as he's falling down. Just wonderful stuff. In so many ways, the personification of 1950s sci-fi that you would find at the drive-in in a double feature, for which Bert I. Gordon became very famous because he would very often direct the co-features for his movies at American International. You have The Amazing Colossal Man, so Bert decided to go in the opposite direction with Attack of the Puppet People, starring John Agar and June Kenney, and also the first appearance of his daughter Susan, who plays a little girl who comes in to see toy maker John Hoyt, and she can't believe that all of his toys are so lifelike, including a cat that is in a matchbox. And she always wants to play with the cat, and John Hoyt has to be a little strict with her because he doesn't want her to find out that he's invented a technique to miniaturize people and keep them as dolls, quote unquote, that can be his friends forever. John Agar used to love to tell the story that while he was making this movie, that he had asked Bert I. Gordon to be released early on a specific day, and that didn't happen. And Agar got angry because it was his bowling night, and working on Attack of the Puppet People messed up his bowling night. And boy, John remembered that for quite some time. The thing is, with Attack of the Puppet People, showed Bert's also his ability in working with giant-sized props, and again, choosing the right director of photography to work with him, in this case, Ernest Laszlo. And Laszlo, again, was a great director of photography and was a big studio guy, and he would later, of course, shoot Fantastic Voyage, which in many ways kind of the Attack of the Puppet People and these effects pictures that Ernest Laszlo was shooting was kind of the precursor to what he would be expected to accomplish on Fantastic Voyage. And Laszlo does a beautiful, clean, black and white job on Attack of the Puppet People. The imagery in that movie is just wonderful. The half sheet and the one sheets to that film are absolutely superb. It was a beautiful painting by Reynold Brown of the puppet people attacking a snarling German shepherd with a butcher knife that they're all carrying and trying to stab at his face. It's incredible. Unfortunately, that scene is not in the movie, which is not the biggest crime in the world or really that unusual for American International. But the film itself is, again, I think another step forward for Bert I. Gordon. It also showed, again, something that he tried to be consistent with, is that our heavy, John Hoyt, is not really a heavy. Here's a man, he is lonesome. He has created this technology to have friends that he can keep forever, basically. So we understand him and we feel for him and we have great empathy for him. And yet he still is terrible and has terrorized these people. The very end of the movie is him begging for his friends to come back because they find a way to restore their normal size. And so not just some demonic bad guy who is bent on world conquest or anything like that, is this gentleman who has a heart. And that's the whole reason behind his developing kind of this terrible technology and placing all of these little people's lives in danger, although that was never his intention.
What's that noise?
I don't know.
Universal had a wonderful, very serious hit with Tarantula, directed by Jack Arnold and with John Agar, Mara Corday, and Leo G. Carroll. And just those images by Cliff Stein and David Horsley of the living tarantula walking towards us as it comes down a highway in Arizona, just terrifying. It is the stuff of nightmares. So Bert I. Gordon decides, again working with Ernest Laszlo, to say, no, if it's a giant spider, it must live somewhere like a spider. In Tarantula, there is the giant pools of venom, and they find the bones of cattle and its victims, some human beings. But in this case, in Earth versus the spider lives in a cage that is nothing but these horrible stalagmites and stalactites, and it is absolutely something out of the worst child's dream to get lost in this labyrinth of caves and tunnels and everything else, each one looking like a mouth with these demonic teeth that are ready to devour it. And then there is a giant pit, and you can fall right into the spider's web. And around the pit are bodies in different stages of decomposition, where the spider has been feeding and sucking the life juice out of these corpses, leaving just these shells, these husks of human flesh. Just absolutely startling visions, and so much darker in its own way than what they did at Universal. So that when the giant spider gets loose in the town, what we imagine it's capable of is worse than what we might have seen with Tarantula, only because we've seen this litter of bodies in all these stages of this horrible process and wrapped up in webs, and it's just awful. And so the horror element in Earth versus the Spiders, I think, is much greater than in Tarantula. Now, in some ways, Tarantula is probably the better movie because they certainly have more money to play with. But that, to me, does not lessen the achievement of Earth versus the Spider. And one of the big reasons is it was a project on which Bert I. Gordon worked with the writer George Worthing Yates. One of his very first films was a superb movie directed by Anthony Mann about the assassination of Abraham Lincoln called The Tall Target, starring Dick Powell. George Worthing Yates obviously was a horror and science fiction fan, and he had his own approach to these kinds of things. And we think of him, oh my gosh, that's the guy who wrote Frankenstein 1970, which he did. He did his time with Charles Schneer and Ray Harryhausen at Columbia, writing It Came From Beneath the Sea. But right to the heart of the matter, before working with Bert I. Gordon, George Worthing Yates wrote the story for them, which just put it immediately, I think, in all Film Monster fans' minds, just absolute classic status. So Bert I. Gordon was working with a writer who not only knew the genre, but embraced the genre. And George Worthing Yates, I think, contributed tremendously to his work with Bert I. Gordon.
The foot that made that print is about 10 times the size of a normal man's.
What happens to our world if massive, monstrous man-beasts like this invade us?
The very next movie that Bert I. Gordon made was War of the Colossal Beast. In this case, they throw back to the Cyclops, only here it is the search for Colonel Glenn Manning. He fell off Hoover Dam, but he survived it somehow. Half of his face is now destroyed in an absolutely wonderful makeup worn by Dean Parkin, who was the actor who played the Cyclops. And so he is now wandering around in Mexico, and he is terrorizing the hills, and people are dying in the hills, especially if they're hauling food from one place to another or something, and he attacks these grocery convoys and hunting parties and things like that just to survive. And his sister comes to Mexico looking for him. He is found and captured. And I think in a wonderful thing that Yates creates, they think they can try and help this man who now can only basically scream and moan and that thing. But the whole idea is, if he is captured, can the military, in fact, ultimately reverse his growth? And there's a wonderful sequence of shots with all these government officials saying, oh, you have this giant. Well, I'm sorry, that's really a job for Homeland Security. Cut to Homeland Security. This sounds like something really the Pentagon ought to handle. Cut to the Pentagon. Boy, I don't know. I think Congress needs to do a special appropriation for it. It's absolutely wonderful and unfortunately absolutely true, because if you had this giant monster and you were looking for a place to store him, the government would say, don't look at us. He escapes. And his sister is like, please, for God's sakes, don't kill him. But now he is on the loose in Griffith Park, and his appearance alone is absolutely terrifying for everybody. There's a school bus of kids, and they're up there on a field trip, and he grabs that school bus, and he's shaking it over his head, and the kids are, flying around inside the school bus. And his sister runs up to him and says, Glenn, please think what you're doing. Please put the children down. And Glenn has memories of her. It resonates with him. And again, we're kind of tugging at the heartstrings. He looks absolutely horrible, is mortified by his own actions, puts down the school bus, walks to some high tension wires, which is a beautiful miniature, and like the creature from the Black Lagoon and The Creature Walks Among Us, commits suicide by grabbing the high tension wires, one of the few monsters to commit suicide, and that moment is in color.
It's the civilized world in blood-freezing horror as the immeasurable power of this colossal beast threatens a war of brutality such as we've never known.
Oh, no, Glenn, no!
The black and white double features that American International specialized in, the Universal was doing on a slightly bigger scale, that Roger Corman was doing. They were being phased out because now here came horror in color. So Bert I. Gordon, being very smart and very astute, looked at what other movies were making money at that time in the theater. And he wanted to always appeal to a young audience. So he stepped back from American International and went back to being an independent producer-director again.
Nobody lets me do anything I want to. I wish I was far away from here. I wish I was on a pirate ship.
Bend the rigging and step lively, or have your ears in me chowder tonight, you blasted sons of Cyclops!
Where am I?
Bert I. Gordon made a deal with Embassy Pictures and Joseph E. Levine, who now had a good deal of money because of the success of Hercules and Hercules Unchained. So he had gone from just being a distributor and theater owner to actually somebody you could go to who would finance production from the ground up. Starring Charles Herbert of The Fly and later of 13 Ghosts, and Bert's own daughter, Susan Gordon, once again. And we should say that Susan did not just work for her dad. She was actually in the Danny Kaye movie, The Five Pennies, directed by Michael Curtiz, and she's very good as Danny Kaye's daughter. So she was working for other directors other than her dad. But for The Boy and the Pirates, she and Charles Herbert basically play adventuresome kids who get involved with pirates in a way that, if you will, Jim Hawkins did in Treasure Island. Now, Treasure Island And the Disney live action movies had a big impact, I think, on Bert Gordon deciding to make this film. And he found a very good script by Bernard Schoenfeld, and also turned around and he asked Ernest Haller, the DP who had photographed Gone with the Wind and also would photograph Mildred Pierce at Warner Brothers with Joan Crawford, and later for Robert Aldrich, Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, to go behind the camera. So he was, again, always cognizant of, let me get the best cameraman I could find. He always picked these old school, wonderful cinematographers. So he ended up with this inexpensive, if you will, kind of in the vein of the large-scale live-action films that Disney was now specializing in, and did it for a fraction of the cost because he had gotten this crew together, and usually always led by a superb director of photography.
You look as if you were ready to kill me.
Now you get this straight. I'm marrying Meg.
And you get this straight, Tom Stewart. No one will ever have you but me.
Help me! Please, Tom, help me! Take my hand! Pull me out! Save me, Tom, please! Please save me! Please!
Bert would always, I think, look at trends. He would start thinking in terms of, I've kind of done the semi-Disney adventure thing, but ghost stories seem to be coming back. Of course, Robert Wise's The Haunting and all these things done very close to 1960. Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho was not a ghost story, but the impact of that movie, just as a horror film, was so just incalculable. So everybody was thinking, how do we knock off Psycho, including William Castle, with movies like Homicidal? But Bert I. Gordon, working with George Worthing Yates, said, let's go in a slightly different direction. Let's go with mental derangement, but it is a ghost story, not completely unlike Lewis Allen's wonderful The Uninvited in the 1940s. And here was a story of a man who is, in fact, haunted by guilt, and he cannot get around all of the hallucinations and what he constantly is seeing as reminders of his crimes, played by Richard Carlson in a very, very good performance, and some absolutely wonderful optical effects created by Bert and Flora Gordon. This maybe is certainly one of his most mature movies, and again, thanks to Ernest Laszlo, one of his most handsome movies. Was shot in black and white, but there is a tremendous effect. They're holding a head of a beautiful blonde girl who's been decapitated, and the head starts to speak. And that moment was one of the absolutely favorite stills published in Famous Monsters of Filmland in their You Axed For It column. I used to love reading that, and it's like, oh, look who axed for it, Joe Dante. But then he was, 20-year-old Joe Dante from Philadelphia, or whoever it was, all these names listed underneath. But there was that shot of that decapitated head speaking to Richard Carlson, and was just absolutely wonderful. Was a, if you will, sophisticated movie, and much more so than I think people would normally expect from Bert I. Gordon, because he was still considered Mr. Big, and with all the giant grasshoppers and what have you in those drive-in pictures. Now, this was still a drive-in movie for independently picked up, but it was of a different stripe because horror was changing. And suddenly horror was not necessarily just the stuff of teenagers, and if you will, the genre was shifting and trying to find its own place. And there was Bert I. Gordon trying to find his place within the genre. Now, what he did, which was very, very smart, because he could have kept kind of chasing and outguessing the way that horror movies were going to go, and he did not. Instead, he looked at an entirely different source, and I believe was Ray Harryhausen and Charles Schneer.
My 7 curses! Unreach the dragon's lair!
Your curses won't stop me from reaching your castle.
The Princess Elaine will make a delicate dish for my dragon in exactly 7 days' time.
The success that Harryhausen and Schneer had with movies like The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad and Jason and the Argonauts and Mysterious Island, there was just this, if you will, fantasy thing in the air, and the idea of the Knights of the Round Table and people who dabbling in sorcery and dragons to be slain and all this type of stuff was all going on there in the movies. So Bert I. Gordon decided to do The Magic Sword. And The Magic Sword was his most elaborate movie up to that point. It had some very funny bits in it with this thing. It was just a story of a knight in shining armor who was battling a sorcerer played by Basil Rathbone, who was creating all sorts of mayhem, including a dragon. Estelle Winwood is a very wacky witch, a terrifying witch-like hag from Vampira, who just turns into this, hideous monster. The movie is beautifully shot, and it is really the ultimate, I think, kiddie matinee. And this was Bert I. Gordon kind of fighting back against Schneer and Harryhausen, or at least something that would be the co-feature. And certainly the film featured the most sophisticated effects that Bert I. Gordon had created up to that point, working with his wife, the rear projection, the matte shots, the creation of the fire-breathing dragon itself. Absolutely wonderful. And there was an article in Famous Monsters at the time of the movie's release called Flashy Gordon Conquers the Universe. And Forrest Ackerman was always there to give Bert I. Gordon's projects a boost and make sure that young readers knew about them. And there was a companion article promoting The Magic Sword, and that's what Flashy Gordon Conquers the Universe was about. Bert was making The Magic Sword at the time, but a companion piece called Smile If You Call Him Monster about Basil Rathbone, who could get a little prickly about his association with horror. He is just wonderful in The Magic Sword, and just literally the personification of every evil storybook wizard that we'd ever read about or saw in an animated film or whatever it might be in Bert I. Gordon's movie. And the movie itself fulfills its mission as a kiddie matinee. It wouldn't have been an 8-year-old kid on the planet who did not end up loving this movie, particularly after he saw these great pictures of it in various movie magazines.
I wonder if this makes everything grow. Hey, will you cut it out and leave it alone, huh?
Listen, Freddie boy, if I want to try some of this stuff, just don't you try and stop me, understand?
And try it they did.
For years, Bert I. Gordon had been announcing his intention to do a movie adaptation of H.G. Wells' Food of the Gods. He went to Embassy Pictures, again noting what was popular in movie theaters at this time, and he wanted to do something with teenagers and also with rock and roll. So he decided to adapt Food of the Gods into kind of a bizarre rock and roll Bikini Beach teenage monster movie that really doesn't have any monsters in it, but has giant, gorgeous teenage girls. And that's Village of the Giants. The young cast includes, of course, Beau Bridges and Tisha Sterling and the gorgeous Joy Harmon. The great poster is of Johnny Crawford hanging on a giant blob in front of Joy Harmon, and he's looking down because she's now absolutely gigantic. And also Ronnie Howard as the young genius who finds Food of the Gods and creates it and even enlarges his own dog. The film now is, you see clips from it all the time because the teenagers, they of course, bust out of their clothes, whatever, and they make togas and things out of curtains and sheets and say, hey man, we're taking over this town. So you've got that great electric guitar going and that great slow motion dancing, and the adults, absolutely, they don't know what to do. And that's the whole point of the movie, is now the teenagers can crush the adults if they choose to do it. And it's just such a wild ride. And to think that H.G. Wells' name is on this movie with these kids busting out of their swimming trunks and everything is really pretty remarkable. But God bless Bert I. Gordon, because boy, he said he was going to do it, and he did it.
Whether you like it or not, little man, we're just gonna have to show you what's good for you, that's all.
Maybe we don't like your club either.
You're in it anyway.
And now the movie's cult reputation is so huge. But Bert would, of course, return to Food of the Gods with yet another adaptation later on in the 70s.
Killers should be punished. Killers should be punished. Punished. Killers should be punished. Punished.
Through a young girl's eyes, you will see torment, torture, and flaming horror as she is driven to the brink of insanity by the gnawing knowledge of her own guilt in horrifying evil.
He decided to do a psychological horror film that was much more along the lines of Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, Hush Hush Sweet Charlotte, Homicidal. These movies that generally had older actresses in them, and that what they used to call, disrespectfully, hag horror. And Bert made his own called Picture Mommy Dead. And it starred Martha Heyer and Don Amici and Zsa Zsa Gabor, and it was about a very wealthy family that was hiding this horrible suicide, and Susan Gordon plays a young girl who has been released from a mental hospital and returns home and has always believed that her mother was the victim of this horrible conspiracy. So she has illusions about it, including seeing a necklace a diamond necklace that her mother always wore, and seeing it almost as a talisman of death. And the mystery slowly unravels in front of her. And the story itself also bears kind of a striking resemblance to Jimmy Sangster's Nightmare, which was one of his black and white hammers, what he called his mini Hitchcocks. But it showed another stripe of Bert I. Gordon's talent. So Picture Mommy Dead is about as far away from Attack of the Puppet People as you were ever going to get. But it showed that Bert I. Gordon was making that move. So suddenly there he is, and he's like, listen, if Robert Aldrich can do this, so can I, and he did. What Bert I. Gordon wanted to do, he actually achieved. And he achieved this over and over again. Who could ask for any more than to be able to sustain a career from the very early 1950s all the way through the 2000s? Very few filmmakers were able to do it, and very few B filmmakers were able to always return and come back with one more idea, one more giant monster, which is why they called him Mr. Big.